Okay, so I'm going to do a double top stitch with this next stitch. So I've got my machine all set up, ready from before. I went ahead and cut 2 pieces of fabric that are 10 inches long and 4.5 inches wide, and I've got 2 of them. What I'll do is pick a side, and I'm going to line them up exactly so that I can sew my 1/2 inch seam. So I'll just pick these 2 here, line them up, and I'll start with a pin going perpendicular to the direction that I'm going to be sewing at the end, and I'll do another pin in the center and then one more at the last end to make sure this doesn't move while I'm sewing. Oh, something that I just noticed, and this you'll kind of notice too depending on when you're sewing. See, I've put the ball of my pin in this direction so I can pull it out, but here it's going the other way. It usually is actually easier if you do it in this direction, because as you're sewing you can pull to this side. So no big deal. I mean, sometimes I just do it whichever way, but if we're talking about best practices, that's the best way to do it, so that your ball is this way so you can pull it right out. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is sew my 1/2 inch seam. So I'll set this up, presser foot down. I'm holding onto these pieces of thread for the first 2 stitches. I'm walking it with my hand. I can now let those go, and I'm right there on top of my pin. So I'll pull that presser foot up, needle down, and pull that pin right out so I can get started. Okay, needle's still down. Might walk it one more just to get going. Turn the machine on, and I'm going to sew at my 1/2 inch with the foot pedal. I'm just keeping this in line with my 1/2 inch mark, and again getting close to this other pin. So I will walk it until my needle is firmly down into the fabric. Presser foot up, pull that pin right out, presser foot back down, and I can continue. Nice and slow and steady. It often tries to take off like a racehorse when you first start it. So I'm practicing my slow and steady, and I suggest you do the same. Whew, I'm getting close to this pin, so needle down, presser foot up, you can pull that pin right out, and presser foot back down to finish it off. And I can even walk these last few stitches if I want to, rather than using the foot pedal. So needle is up. See how the needle is up? Presser foot up, pull, and clip those threads at about 1 or 2 inches. So I've got my 1/2 inch seam sewed all the way down 1/2 inch from the edge, okay? I can clip this side of thread, and a little bit different for this double top stitch is that we're going to press the seam open. This is a lot more common with most pressing that we do. Basically, every time you sew a seam, you're going to press it. You're going to go over to the iron and press it in some way to prep it for the next step. So usually you do press the seams open. And when I say press it open, I mean just what I'm showing you right now. I take that seam allowance and open it up, and that's how I'll press it, right? So from the front, what's nice, like you can kind of see through the 2 layers, it's going to look the same on both sides, okay? So that's the most common way to do this. So let's press this seam open. And again, I'm going to start from behind the back side, the bad side, and I can even take my hand, is what I usually do, and like mock press it just with my fingers, just to again make sure that I'm working out any wrinkles. I'm stretching from both sides. I want this to be very taut. I want to pull and see puckers. I don't want to lose any fabric when I'm pressing this. So I'll come from the back side, and I'm just pressing that seam open. Go ahead and press the whole sample while I'm there. I'll flip it over and I'll inspect. So here is my seam. See how you can see through it with the light shining through? And I've got seam allowance on both sides. This is pressed open. Okay, so now I'll also press from the front. Again, this is my pretty side, my outside. I want to make sure this looks good. So I'll press that from that direction. So I've got it like this. I've got my seam pressed open, and now I'm going to do a double top stitch. And what that means in this case, you could do 2 lines of stitching on one side, and similar to the top stitch that we did. But what I'm going to do for this exercise is I'm going to sew a top stitch on one side and a top stitch on the other side. It'll be very symmetrical. This would be a great way to lock down both sides of the frayed seam allowance. Okay, so I'll show you what I'll do. I'm still going to do a 1/4 inch from this edge, which means I'm going to line it up next to my presser foot. Okay, so I can sew on this side first because it's going to be really similar to the last one I did. So again, I'm coming about a 1/4 inch from the very edge of the fabric, placing my presser foot down to lock it in place. I'm going to hold on to these pieces of thread for the first few stitches, and then I'm walking it towards me for the first few stitches. And notice how I am in line with the presser foot right on that seam that I just sewed, okay? And my goal is to keep it there the entire time and sew a straight line down. Nice and even, nice and slow and steady, all the way to the end. Okay, I've gotten to the end. My needle is down, so I walk it one more repetition to get that needle up, presser foot up, and then I can pull. Okay, I've snipped that right there, and see what I've got? I've got a top stitch sewn a 1/4 inch from that edge all the way down. Here's what it looks like from behind. I'll go ahead and snip my starting threads. So I've encapsulated this bit of frayed seam allowance all the way down, okay? And now I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the other side. Okay, so I'm going to sew another top stitch on this side, and we'll call that a day. So I can flip it around like I just did, and I can sew just like that. So I can sew in the exact same way, right? Keeping my presser foot in line with the seam. Or I could do the opposite side, right? I could also sew from this way and keep my seam in line with this edge of the presser foot. It's identical, so it's whatever you want to do, whatever makes more sense for you. Just for funsies, I'm going to show you the opposite way. So again, I'm starting from about a 1/4 inch from the edge. My presser foot is down. I've held on to these first threads for the first few stitches. I'm walking it towards myself, and I can let that go. And now I'm ready to go. I'm going to keep this in line all the way down. I'm just focusing on slow and steady. There we go. I've got to the end. My needle is up, so I can just walk my wheel a little bit to make sure that stays up. Presser foot up, and I'm going to snip that. So there we go. I've got an identical seam now sewn on this side, equidistant from the center, about a 1/4 inch over, and I have captured my seam allowance and my fray from the back. Okay, so what you're looking for is that none of this fray is coming undone or it's coming out. I want the back to be capturing the seam allowance, right, successfully. So if you've come over too far with your stitch and some of this fray is coming out and you haven't actually captured the seam allowance, you're going to get points off for that. And from the front, I want it to look nice and even and symmetrical and pretty from the front. I want it to be really straight. I'm just clipping any extra threads that I've got, and what I'll do lastly, of course, is to press it again. See how when I've sewed, I've created like ever so slight wrinkles in here, and that's going to happen. That's fine. That's why the last stage is always pressing. Press, press, press. You can hit this with a little steam, whatever you need to do to get it absolutely beautiful. So now I have a much more crisp double top stitch. And in this case, that just means that it's sewn a top stitch on each side of the seam. Again, you could do, I'm going to show you my previous, you could do a different type of double top stitch where you had this stitch here where we've got just single top stitch, and you could just sew another stitch line very close to that, either on this side or on this side. That's also a double top stitch, but I am happy for you to do these guys. Single top stitch, double top stitch. Okay, press them really neatly, document them front and back, and you'll be all set with this week.